Good afternoon. This is David Bernstein, President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. We are here with the CRCast, our bi-monthly webcast for the Jewish community relations field on Jewish advocacy and Jewish community relations issues. We are really delighted this week to have with us Lacey Schwartz, who is the Director of National Outreach for Lashon, an organization that works with and for Jews of color, and we're really looking forward to talking to you, Lacey. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us about Lashon. When was it created? What's the mission?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to start by making a small correction, which would say we definitely work with and for Jews of color, but not solely. And I think it's one of the main points I would start with, which is that you're an organization that works around racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity, but look at that as connected to the larger issue of global Jewish peoplehood and how that is very much a part of all of our Jewish communities. And so it is not in any way, something that is only relevant to people who identify as people of color, Jews of color specifically. And I think that is part of the reality about creating a more inclusive world, is that it's not about the pigeonholing or tokenization of people from different backgrounds, but it's really embracing the totality of who we are in a full way. So on that note, the organization was founded. It is going to be next year, the 18th year. It's going to be the 18th year of the organization. It was started as a project coming out of the Institute for Jewish and Social Research. Institute for Jewish and Community Research. And it was an organization that really started as what we were doing as an organization, very much research-based. And we're interested in doing research on kind of the larger Jewish community that was primarily, I think, kind of looked at as kind of normalized around the idea of white Ashkenazi Jews, really wanting to expand the understanding of who else really is part of that community, and did a lot of research and studies on that, and did focus groups as well. And at the time, the founders were actually a white Jewish couple who were adopting an African-American child, and really were aware of how much the kind of norms were operating within the community, and wanted to do their part to change that and to open it up and to empower various leaders from all different backgrounds to be able to have a role. The organization started in San Francisco, but has expanded with offices and works projects around the world, including Uganda, Israel, South America, Europe, as well as in New York and the Midwest and various other places.
Great. So, and we're looking forward to going deeper on some of that. But I wanted to start. I heard your personal story when you spoke at the ADL conference in Washington a couple of months ago, and was really moved by it. And I thought maybe you would share that with us as well.
Absolutely. So, beyond working with Lashon, I am a filmmaker, a writer, director, producer, which is what I've been doing since actually went to law school, but that's a whole other story. And I ended up in law school going into film, and have been doing that ever since, over 15 years now. And my personal story is what very much led me to Lashon, but also as a filmmaker, one of the things that I was really impressed with at Lashon, besides the how much the actual mission resonated with me on a personal level, was also that they, as an organization, have always from the inception really understood the importance of using media to connect to people and to be an effective tool for social impact. And so that was really one of the main reasons I connected with them, as I was working on a personal documentary that I made about my own story, which is that I grew up in upstate New York, where I still live. And for me in particular, I was in Woodstock, New York, with two white Jewish parents. I was born to and raised within a white Jewish family, and found out at the age of 18 that my biological father was Black. My mother had an affair, and nobody talked about it. And I spent quite a few years, almost a decade, in what I consider to be a racial closet, where I had had the conversation with my mother about the truth of my paternity and my identity, but did not talk about it with my extended family. And so I set out to make a film about really focusing very specifically on my story, but on a broader level, focusing on the issues of dual identity and family secrets.
Wonderful. So I'm going to invite our listeners, viewers to submit questions in writing that I'll be able to see and try to get to as we go through this. But in the meantime, who are Jews of color? What groups do you include in that mix of people?
So I personally am not if you're asking me personally, I am not here to define it for other people. I think different people identify in different ways, and that is for them to define that. I can speak for myself as somebody who does identify as both Jewish and as a person of color. That for me is both because of my my actual kind of background heritage, but it's also about kind of the consciousness and the way that I have interacted with this world. And we all know that race is very much a social construct. It is not a biological reality. And a lot of times, though, we live in a world that has been normalized around whiteness and around certain, in the Jewish community, certainly around Eastern European norms of the Jewish culture. And so, which obviously is not synonymous with being white. Like I'm somebody who's Ashkenazi Jewish, but identify as Black, biracial. So, I think it's really for people to define themselves. Some people are Latino, identify as people of color, and some people who do not. And, some people will be Latino and Black. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that ethnically and racially you can identify, and also culturally. And so for me, I'm not somebody where it's really about the distinction between just being a person of color and not a person of color within this work. And I think I look at it as more of a self-identification issue.
I guess part of what I was getting at is that I know that there's a question of how Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews might identify. And I know from my conversations on campus that some young Mizrahi Jews are choosing that identity. And I was just trying to get a sense of how widespread is it that some Mizrahi Jews are using that to describe their own identities? Or is that something that is still very much in...
There's some people, whether or not it's in the Jewish community or not, obviously there are Arab, Middle Eastern people who do identify as people of color. They feel like that is their experience in the world, that is the community they come out of. Again, when you talk about how widespread is it, I think it's a reality. And a lot of this is, as I said, defined around what the norms are that people are relating to.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that 20% of students Jewish students on college campuses today identify as Jews of color. I've heard 10% in the larger Jewish community. I know demographics is not your main focus, but do you have any sense of what number do you all use regularly when you talk about it?
We use about 20%, which is what our research showed, and then we work closely with UJA in New York, and they did a population study in 2011 where there are numbers of people who were identified as, as a racially, ethnically, or culturally diverse Jews, pretty much matched what our research said 10 years earlier.
Great. So, are we witnessing sort of an emerging consciousness within the Jewish community about Jews of color? Is this, I'm thinking back just a few years ago, would conversations like this have happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago? How much is this gaining steam now within the Jewish world, and perhaps even among Jews of color?
So it's emerging for some and not for others, is what I would say. 5 years ago, yes, this conversation was happening. 10 years ago, it was happening, but maybe happening a little bit less in, like, quote unquote, mainstream Jewish spaces. 15 years ago, it probably wasn't happening nearly as much. But again, we've been around for, give or take, 18 years. So it's a hard question to ask me. I've been working with the organization for over a decade. So when you're asking me now, do we still encounter people on a daily basis to which they are not thinking about these issues? And also, are we also still encountering people who as themselves identify as Jews of color, but are not grouped into a larger, do not have a network in which they know other people like them? Yes, that's still happening. Like, people are still living in isolation around their identity. I do think that the world we live in has changed significantly in terms of social media and the tools that we have. So there is ways in which people, and just in general, I mean, both in the space we work in, but overall, that felt previously isolated, finding an easier way to connect with people who they kind of feel like demographically or maybe more similar to. So those things have definitely changed. We have in technology and social media, but and then I mean I think it opens up to a larger question, which is that, you know, there's awareness, and then there's of a reality, there's a consciousness, and then there's kind of like that consciousness really permeating into the reality of the community, so the community can start to balance itself out and not necessarily give preferences to certain kind of norms and biases over others. So I think that, you know, that's what I would say is kind of where we are, is that, like, yes, maybe the issue is, in a sense, emerge as one that people are familiar with, but the question is, what are people really doing, both in the community and individual basis, to make that reflected in their reality?
Well, I know you said B'chol Lashon has been around for 18 years. Are there other groups on the national and local scene that are representing and part of the discussion, or is B'chol Lashon the only game in town at this point?
When you say part of the discussion, are there other people that work around like ethnic, cultural, and racial diversity? Absolutely, totally. I mean, there, you know, you brought up earlier, there's obviously groups around Mizrahi identity and Sephardic identity, Latino identity, Black identity, and there's also people who, groups that, you know, both volunteer organizations as well, that are also working around these larger issues. And absolutely, there's, and part of what you're saying is like there's an emergence of these issues being on the table, and there's lots of really incredible leaders who are working these issues, some as consultants, some as what I would consider the audience leaders. They're performers, they're speakers, they're writers. There's a lot of different people working on this issue. And one of the many things that B'chol Lashon does is we love collaborating with other people, because we think that they bring so much to the table. We really want to, as an organization, figure out how to amplify others' voices.
Are there some key figures in the community that are sort of standard bearers for this now, or is it an are there other key people that are sort of representing this out there in the Jewish world?
Yes, tons. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, what can Jewish organizations do to welcome Jews of diverse backgrounds, such as Jews of color? How can they become more inclusive?
I think that there's a few different things. I mean, there's many different things, but I do think that first and foremost, they have to realize that beyond just educating themselves about the reality of the community, they also have to be willing to do some work on themselves, and be willing to do some work on, you know, acknowledging some of the, you know, the ways in which they have looked at things. Like, so for instance, I can just speak for myself, which is a little bit of what I spoke about in ADL, right? I grew up in a space where being Jewish was, for all intents and purposes, synonymous with being white, you know, and we really didn't question that. And so when we encountered something that was challenged that worldview, we were asked to like kind of push back on it, like, oh, where did you come from? How can you be Jewish? Those ideas. And so I was in many ways on this kind of lived on the line a little bit, where I grew up in this space where I was used to this idea of being Jewish was something specific and monocultural and monoethnic and monoracial. But at the same time, I knew that people looked at me as different. And so I kind of exist in this space where, like, in certain ways, I was understood why people would be kind of closed-minded to the different ways that you could be Jewish, but at the same time, I knew what it was like to kind of feel like you didn't belong in a lot of ways. So I think that, you know, one of the things that communities can do, and obviously this is a short answer, a much longer answer, is in addition to actually educating themselves about the reality of the community, is to actually do the work at looking at some of the ways in which it may seem that organizations function in a neutral way, or are in fact reinforcing a lot of norms around how people should be. And, you know, for instance, like we do our Sleepaway Camp is running right now in Northern California. And so what we do with our sleepaway camp is a curriculum that we have built called Passports to Peoplehood. And so when the campers show up at the beginning of the summer, they get a passport every day they get to the country. And they get to explore Jewish practices, identity, celebrations through food, culture, through that country and through the people of that country. And so, it's just really being, and as part of that, though, it's not just, again, as I said, learning about it, but it's also being able to dig deep and ask ourselves, where did we come from? What are the assumptions that we are making about the rest of the world? And how can we have to actually do the work to actually break down some of the ways in which we can socialize to, in fact, think that one way is the way you're supposed to be versus another way. And I know I personally had to do that work, and that's a lot of what I did in my film, which is, by the way, called Little White Lie. And it's one of the reasons that Lashon was an executive producer of that film, because we really utilize it as, by sharing my journey, it kind of encourages other people to be able to dig in and not necessarily do the exact same thing, but to actually be able to be comfortable digging in and breaking down some of the assumptions that they may be carrying with themselves out into the world.
Great. So I'm going to ask some other questions from our viewers. What are some of the top issues facing Jews of color, and how do these differ, if at all, from the broader Jewish community?
I mean, in certain ways, I think I got into some of this in my last answer, probably a bit. But what I would say is, listen, I mean, as somebody who is American, and identifies as a person of color, like, I experience these issues of kind of racial bias as an American, and also within the Jewish community. And we have to understand that these things overlap. I do think within the Jewish community, some of the difference can be that within the Jewish community, it's even more insular, and it's kind of built around certain understandings of who Jewish people are, and sometimes we have to be able to challenge that idea.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples from another viewer of how Jewish communities think that they are, quote unquote, color neutral, but are not? Or have you not thought about that?
Oh, no, I've thought about that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, neutral is a great word, which I really appreciate, because it's like, a lot of times, for instance, like, even whatever reason, this is the examples, even in terms of music, right? There are different musical traditions that different communities use, and so people can consider, like, one way to be like, oh, this is just a neutral, but not actually looking at the history of it, or even like foods, like some communities eat rice for Passover. There's just different ways of different communities celebrate things differently, and so you might look at something, and because it has become so normalized, even as we know, like, even within Israel, which is such a diverse space, there is still a hierarchy of how things are celebrated and how things are done. And certainly within, I think, the U.S. context, we certainly have, it's almost like Ashkenazi culture is in many ways almost like, kind of looked at as like the neutral culture, like that's what being Jewish is. Well, that's not what being Jewish is for everyone. So, there are certain people where some of the Ashkenazi traditions and traditions are not what they practice. And so when those are looked at as, in fact, neutral, and they're not owned as being what they are, that.
Right, so if you think that a corned beef sandwich is the ultimate Jewish food, and you don't think about that it's really an Ashkenazic Jewish food, then you're not really giving credit to the entirety of Jewish culture, or you're not even fully acknowledging the ways of being Jewish.
Totally, or like when somebody says something like, oh my God, you look so Jewish. Well, that might seem neutral kind of on its face, but actually in reality, there's a lot of assumptions that are being made in that statement.
Right. Some people are saying that sometimes you're fading out. I hear it a little bit. So speaking directly in the mic makes a huge difference.
Okay, I'm going.
Okay. To what degree do you get involved in some like broader social public policy issues like criminal justice reform, immigration, others that might be on the Jewish community relations agenda? Is that part of it, or is that outside of your mission area?
Organizationally, obviously, these issues can come up. It is not directly related to our mission. on a personal level, I would say that everybody in our organization is very invested in those issues and obviously understands the way in which those issues can, in fact, be affecting different communities that we work with. Although it is not directly related to mission, I definitely do work around those issues.
Right. I've gotten a couple questions about different local communities. One is there's a congregation in Valley Stream, Long Island, composed almost entirely of African American Jews. Have you been there? There's another similar question about the Black Jewish communities in Philadelphia, Bethel, and Chicago. Does your organization have connections with them? How do you relate to some of these congregations or some of these local activists?
I am not familiar with the community in Valley Stream. I have heard of the one in Philadelphia, but I'm not, personally, I have not worked with them, so I'm not in a position to answer that.
Right. Someone also asked about the Black Israelite community, B'nai Adat Kol Beth Yisrael, if that's something that you've also been connected to in any way, and if that figures into the identity or into the mix of activities.
Again, for us, we do work around, it's more about self-identification as people who are identifying as being Jewish, practicing Judaism, and who are identifying, not, as I said at the very beginning, not just people of color, but are connected to these issues. We're not necessarily, we really believe in being inclusive and being welcoming to different people who are interested in engaging with Judaism. So there's been different communities we've worked with at different points. And based on how that's progressed, some of them we would work with and some of the other with. And again, I'm not currently working as much with Israelite communities. We have in the past worked with a little bit more, but not recently.
Mm-hmm. Another question, what advice do you have for an African-American Jew seeking to work in their community, but is prevented from doing so because of biases or racism from Ashkenazic white Jews?
From working, you mean like literally professionally? Like actually getting
I'm doing the best I can to convey their question.
No. I mean, it's a hard, so it's hard for me to tell from that question. I don't know if somebody can clarify, but if you're asking if somebody is actually seeking a job and is not getting one, that would sound directly like employment discrimination. So that sounds like more of a legal issue. If the question is more in terms of working more in a community sense, it's like a lay leader.
Job. Well, what does job employment?
Employment. If it's an employment issue, I mean that sounds like if they're not being welcome because of race, that sounds like a discrimination issue, which is a little bit less of something I'm in a position to give advice about on this in this space.
Sure. Questions about how does Israel connect to are there any particular ways that Jews of color, B'chol Lashon perhaps more specifically, connect with Israel? How does Israel figure into the consciousness that we've been talking about?
I mean, I would never speak about how Israel figures into the consciousness of Jews of color as a group. I cannot make that generalization. There's about as much diversity within the people who might identify as Jews of color as anybody else. So I cannot speak to that at all. In terms of the work we do, we certainly have worked in space in Israel. I mean, as I said, we work in a global space, and Israel is certainly part of a global Jewish community.
Right. So you talked about the camp, which was fascinating. Are there other specific programs that you have that help with these issues, as you put it, well, I mean, I'll let you put it in your own words, but are there any specific programs that you've?
Yeah, I mean, we do a ton of programs. We do local programming. We also do a lot of stuff I mentioned earlier around leadership networks, both within in New York, but also on college campuses, working with students who are college campuses can sometimes be, obviously on many levels, tricky spaces to navigate in terms of identity, and helping Jewish students who are looking for an inclusive space to be able to navigate that and collaborate. We also are taking the program that I mentioned earlier with our camp, the Passport to Peoplehood curriculum, and expanding that out to be able to be a curriculum to be used in many spaces. We also do a lot of media workshops with the Speakers Bureau, We have all different kinds of individuals who speak, perform, filmmakers, and doing a lot of work. And when we can use a lot of the materials that we develop to also do workshops, we go in and not only meet with communities, but go into organizations to help them address some of these issues, sometimes with the actual culture of the organization, not only to the groups of people that we serve. We also collaborate with lots of different people. Like this was kind of the world. We did a variety of different holiday celebration guides and all sorts of things like that.
Great. So I think the last question, I think there are a number of viewers are surprised by this 20% figure of Jews of color, and they're asking, how do we get that out there to help raise awareness in the organized Jewish community that it's a much larger segment and that there is an inclusivity problem? How do we get, what suggestions do you have for us to help support this and make sure that there's greater inclusiveness and cultural change in the Jewish community?
I mean, I would say it's not just about, again, communication and education of the issue, but it's really looking at the communities and the institutions that you're a part of and looking at why are they not more inclusive? You know, why are, you know, kind of relates back to, again, I can't speak to that employment issue that the person was asking about before because I don't know the ins and outs of it, but to really look at the space you're living in and say, if you're living in a, you know, a segregated space, why is that? And why doesn't, you know, you can say like, oh, they're not around, or maybe there's one person, but like, are you really creating a space that is welcoming? When you look at the pictures on the wall, when you look at the terms that are being used, you look at how people are or are not welcomed in. When are they considered legitimate? And these are all ways that, you know, and we have tons of resources on our website at globaljews.org. Again, it's globaljews.org, or you can go to Lashon, BECHOL, with lots of tools, lots of articles. It can really just help increase the conversation. I think first and foremost, being accountable, looking at yourself and saying, does my life reflect both the reality of the Jewish people, but also what I believe in? You know, if I believe in an inclusive world and know that that's out there, am I doing what I can, or the institutions that I'm associated with doing what they can to be inclusive? I mean, obviously I have to give a short answer in this context, but that is something that we work on in a much more in-depth way through our organization.
Wonderful. Lacey, this has been so enlightening, and I feel like we have more to talk about. I have to tell you, there's been many questions coming through. I think I've probably gotten more questions from this interview than I have in any other interview that we've done. So I only got to a fraction of them. So it just shows you that there's a lot of interest and a hunger to learn more. And maybe we can have you back, or maybe we can talk to others as well that will help continue to raise consciousness in the Jewish world. I think we have a lot of work to do. So we really appreciate your help.
Well, I appreciate it. And then we'd love to and even have somebody else on from the organization. But I would say that the first step that I would really suggest people do is go on and subscribe to our newsletter. We send out a great monthly newsletter where we curate not only the work that we're doing in the different programs, but we also curate articles around these topics on a monthly basis. So it's an incredible resource, and I really, really strongly suggest that everybody goes online and subscribes to our newsletter. And that's a great first step. And always feel free to reach out to us with more questions at info@globaljews.org, and we're always happy to engage.
Thanks for being with us. And I just want to
thank you for having me.
We will be back in September with other incredible guests, perhaps on Jews of color as well. So please look out for our newsletters and emails and the like. You'll be getting more about the CRCast for this coming season. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.